So here's the thing. We've got about 12 minutes. I know that you're all absolutely burning to see the pitches. So what I want to do is I want to prepare you a little bit for it. And I want to take you on a little bit of a ride, a wild ride into the future. And I want to turn you into what we like to call, you will see this in a second, a practical futurist. So 12 minutes to go. Here's my first question for you. As you're thinking about the future, think about a little bit, what is it you would write into this sentence? The future is blank. What do you put in there? You know, like for my friends here who are on the Zoom call with me on the back end, just throw it into chat. I'm just curious to hear how you define the future. And let me tell you, typically, yes, Dia, the future is ours. Amazing. The future is revolution. So you're getting epic. Jesse says scary. Exactly. So here's the thing. The future is all of the things you're saying, because the way we like to look at the future, and I think this is an important thing to understand, is that the future is what we like to call a paradox. On the one hand, the future is amazing. On the other hand, it's scary, and it's at the same time amazing and scary. But also, if you're thinking about the future, if you want to predict the future, you realize that the future, on one hand, is unwritten. We get to write it every single day. And as Dominika said, it's in everybody's hands. And on the flip side of that, when you look at technology, of course, you can see the early inklings of the future. And that's what we're going to explore today. Another way to think about this is this. If you're standing somewhere here, where the little red dot is, this is your today. Most of us assume there is a future, a future. We like to call this the official future. You know, many of you understand that that official future probably isn't linear. It is exponential, but still there is a future. Now, what we have learned in the futurist community for 50 years is that that's actually not quite right, because there's a widening cone of probable futures surrounded by an even wider cone of possible futures. And it is your role as a leader, and Stephanie said this so eloquently, you're all leaders. It is your role as a leader to identify what are the upper and the lower boundaries of those cones. And then it is your obligation to chart your course through that cone, to define your own future. So there is no official future anymore. The way we like to talk about this, we like to say, kill the official future and embrace the possible futures, plural. So with that being said, let me turn you into what we like to call a practical futurist. A futurist who's taking the future into their own hands, and not in an academic way, but in a truly pirate style, in a way that you actually create the future. And here's everything you need to know about the future summarized in a single slide. And I'm pretty sure you've seen that slide before. The exponential curve. Of course, our future does not happen linearly. The future, which is defined by technology, AI, robotics, synthetic biology, you name it, moves on exponential curves. Now, the good news is I don't need to tell you this anymore. You have seen this before. But I want to point something out. If you are standing where this gentleman stands, and I would argue that in many technologies, that's where we are today, and you look to the past, you realize that the past is flat and linear. And the thing with the past is that it is the only point of reference we have, the only thing we know. Now, if you have the ability to see the future, you realize that the future looks different. It's weird, it's strange. We like to call this a different, a more opportunistic future. And this gentleman here, of course, if you have done your homework in your literary class, you realize this is Ernest Hemingway. Because Ernest Hemingway wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises. And in this book, he has a quote. And we like to use that quote. It's totally out of context, of course. We like to call it the Hemingway law of motion. And it describes our future so well. The short version of the quote is this: gradually and then suddenly. Because the future feels like for a long time when you look at the technology, nothing happens. And then suddenly out of nowhere, it comes and explodes. Which means that it is incredibly important for us to become really good at reading, at seeing the early parts of that curve. And most of us are not good at it. We like to call this weak signals. Amy Webb wrote a book about this. Another way to think about this is We like to call this, and this goes back to the historian Fernand Braudel, the thin wisps of tomorrow. And as Rob Walker, who's a futurist, once said, there is no shortcut. There is no algorithm. If all you do is track what's trending, then all you ever know is exactly what everyone else already knew. To discover, you have to dig. So I encourage you to become really good at digging. So let's dig a little bit. Let me just show you one example of this crazy future. And when we talk about the future, when we talk about exponentials, we need to talk about computers. It's the mother of all exponential trends, of course. And I will not bore you with this old saying, oh, your smartphone is now so powerful like a supercomputer from the 70s. You heard that story so many times. Let me show you something different. Some of you might have seen this. It made the rounds about 6 months ago. And it's a fascinating insight. At the height of the pandemic last summer, a computer hacker bought this device. This is a digital pregnancy test. And he asked himself a very powerful question. He became curious. And by the way, curiosity is truly the skill of the 21st century. He became curious and looked at this digital pregnancy test and asked himself a simple question. Powerful, but simple. I wonder what's inside of this thing. So he bought one. They cost about $3 in the United States. You can buy them, in the drugstore. He bought one, took it apart. What he found is it's a normal pregnancy test, the one with the 2 lines. There's a little sensor reading those 2 lines. There's a computer chip analyzing the data, powered by a battery, showing you on a display if you're pregnant or not. Now, first of all, you can ask yourself, why would you even do that if it's the same thing ultimately? High stress environment. I don't know if you've, and I hope you never get into like a bad situation. It's a super high stress environment. People get confused if you're pregnant, if it's 1 or 2 lines. So it's kind of nice to have a thing which tells you that you're pregnant or not. Now, our computer hacker didn't stop there because he started digging. He asked himself an interesting question. This device cost $3 retail. So clearly, it's much cheaper to manufacture, right? Because you need to manufacture it, you need to bring it to a distributor, that distributor needs to sell it to a drugstore, etc. So this thing can't be that expensive to manufacture. And he asked himself a powerful question, which is, I wonder how expensive is the chip on this device, the little computer, and how powerful is it? And what he found is that this chip, and I just say this one more time, this is a throwaway device. You use this one time. The chip on this device costs $50 and has the raw compute power of the original IBM PC. The very device which essentially created Microsoft. So now we're living in a world where a $50 device, which you throw away after using it once, has the same power as the computer which gave Microsoft its head start. And of course, because we're computer hackers, we put the computer game Doom on there. So next time you're waiting for pregnancy results, you can play a round of Doom. Now, you might look at this and say, this is funny, and it's crazy how far we have come. But here's where it gets interesting. When you look at the history of computing, computers used to be roomfuls of electronics. They used to be massive mainframe computers. And then they became smaller, and they became so small that you can put them on your desk. And then they became smaller, of course, and you can put them into your backpack. And then they became smaller, and you can put them into your back pocket. And now, as my friend Alan Worth-Brock likes to say, they become so small and so cheap and so abundant that they become ambient. And this is fascinating because the moment you get into a world where compute becomes ambient, the world changes one more time. Because every single time we went from one form factor to the next, the world changed dramatically. The companies which dominated this world changed. Way back, mainframe computers dominated by IBM. PCs, of course, dominated by Microsoft. Your handheld devices, your phones, dominated by Apple and Google. And now we're moving into a world which I guarantee you will not be dominated by Apple and Google anymore. There's a whole new playing ground coming up for us. So if you're starting a company, there's an opportunity. And society changes. Mainframes could only be used by big companies. They were so big and expensive. PCs were used by all companies. The web was used by the middle classes. The smartphone, of course, is used by everyone all around the world. And now we are living in a world where compute has become a systematically important part of the fabric of society. The world changes. And that is the reason why I want you to walk through the world with open eyes and keep your eyes peeled to the stuff which makes you say, huh, isn't that interesting? And when you look for weak signals, the early indicators of change, of course, as a pirate, you now see them everywhere. Anything from augmented virtual reality, AI, of course, the blockchain, like the stuff we're doing with space technology, genetics, the sheer fact that we have a vaccine to a global pandemic less than a year after the pandemic breaks out is just marvelous. 3D printing, you name it. So the question then becomes, how do you become the world's best signal spotter? And it's essentially 5 things you want to do. And this is what I encourage you to do. Build this into your routine. There's something we like to call the act of active noticing. Being able to just see these things, see a pregnancy test and ask yourself, well, isn't that interesting? Look for the peculiar behaviors. Look for people doing stuff out of the extraordinary. That allows you to see. Isn't that interesting becomes your best friend. Once you're doing this, you want to stay with the flow. You want to revisit these stimuli. You want to keep digging. Once you start digging, you want to keep your curiosity. You want to seek out weak signals all the time, not just like find one and then be done with it. And lastly, the 2 important factors here is that you want to have strong insights. You want to have beliefs, but you also want them to have them weakly held, meaning you alter them when you get new data. So don't be dogmatic. And lastly, this is important. Keep a distance, maintain a level of objectivity, because it's very easy to get sucked into the vortex of exponentially accelerating technologies and be a little too early. So 5 factors which I think are really important for you as a futurist. And then once you see these signals, measure them according to these 5 signal indicators. Frequency, how often do you see a signal? Is it just once or do you see it over and over again? Strength, is it coming from a reputable source, let's say a researcher, or does it come from like a random dude's tweet? Directionality, is it building on top of each other? So are these signals building and creating a bigger narrative? Maturity, how mature is the underlying technology? Is this in the lab? Is it in research? Is it probably being used? And lastly, spread. Do you see the signal spreading from one industry or sector into other industries and sectors? And of course, lots of the pitches we're seeing today fit beautifully into this framework, because you can now start mapping those out. Now, my friends, here's the important thing. The future is unwritten. It is on you to create the future every single day. It is beautiful, but it's also an obligation, because if you don't write the future will happen to you. And that's a very, very bad position to be in. So go out, hiss the pirate flag, and create the future you want. With that being said, Stephanie, let me bring you back and see if we've got some questions.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Pascal, for telling us how to be, or showing us how to be a practical futurist. Great insights. Because we're heading towards the pitches and we're going to run late if we're not going to speed up. But I have one question, because you mentioned you've been around for a long time. So I would call you kind of a senior moonshot pirate, if you would like that. We can give you that hat if you want to. A personal question, because you gave us a great insight in like a lot like where the future is going to go, tech, a lot of like terms, I think, which will be important for the work for the moonshot pirates. But as a senior moonshot pirate, if you go back to your 15-year-old self, to your 15-year-old moonshot pirate, is there one personal advice you would give your 15-year-old moonshot pirate?
It's a good question. I think the most important thing, quite frankly, the most important thing I can tell you is that there's a saying which is action leads to insight more often than insight leads to action. Meaning you have to go out there, you have to do these things, because when you do them, you learn. And if you just sit back and ponder and think about, very often you don't actually learn all that much. So my encouragement for you is, as a true pirate, get on your barge, get on your ship, hiss the flag, and go out there. You can't sit on shore and just wait and ponder what you could possibly do. So truly, my 15-year-old self, like, go out there, just try things out. If it doesn't kill you, it's totally fine to do it. Just take the risks.